She was just a delivery girl. He was a ruthless millionaire. When Lena Carter outsmarts Alexander Reid in a high-stakes legal debate, she shatters his arrogance and steals his attention. But what starts as a challenge soon turns into something undeniable. When love and ambition collide, will they fight for each other or fall apart? The city was alive with the hum of traffic, raindrops tapping against towering glass buildings. Inside one of the tallest skyscrapers, Reid and Associates, a high-profile corporate law firm, remained illuminated well past working hours. The man behind the massive empire, Alexander Reid, sat in his private office, buried in files. His jaw was tight, his gaze sharp, as he scanned through the details of an upcoming lawsuit. Time was irrelevant to him. Winning was all that mattered. Lena Carter, on the other hand, had no such luxury. For her, every second counted. Every delivery she made chipped away at the mountain of bills sitting on her mother's bedside table at the hospital. Dressed in a worn-out hoodie and jeans, her curly brown hair damp from the rain, she rushed through the pristine lobby of Reid and Associates, ignoring the stares of executives who clearly didn't think she belonged there. The receptionist barely glanced at her. "Delivery entrance is at the back." Lena tightened her grip on the food bag, forcing a smile. "Customer paid for room delivery. I go where the tip takes me." The receptionist raised an eyebrow but waved her through. Two worlds collide. Taking the elevator to the top floor, Lena stepped into a hallway that smelled of power, expensive cologne, polished wood, and dominance. She hesitated only for a second before knocking on the large mahogany door. "Come in." His voice was deep, authoritative, and cold, a voice that had commanded courtrooms and crushed opponents. Lena pushed open the door and stepped inside. Her gaze landed on the man behind the desk. Alexander Reid wasn't just powerful, he was intimidatingly handsome. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored black suit, with raven black hair and piercing grey eyes that flicked up from his paperwork. He barely spared her a glance. "Put it on the table. The money's there." Lena raised an eyebrow, irritation bubbling beneath her exhaustion. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just another rich man too busy to care. As she stepped forward, she heard a voice from his speakerphone. "We need a response by tomorrow, Alex. If we don't counter this clause, the shareholders might have grounds to sue." "That clause is airtight, James. They have nothing to stand on." "Are you sure? Their legal team seems confident." Lena slowed, her legal mind automatically picking up the conversation. "They're bluffing," Alexander stated. "There's no loophole in our contract." Lena frowned. That's not true. It took her less than a second to spot the problem. Her mind worked faster than she could think, analysing, dissecting, recalling every law class she took before her life fell apart. And before she could stop herself, she said, "Actually, there is a loophole." The moment that changed everything silence. Alexander's sharp, steel-grey gaze snapped up to her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as he slowly leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" Lena blinked, realizing what she had done. Oh, crap. She should have just dropped the food and left. But something about the way he looked at her, like she was insignificant, stirred something reckless inside her. "The indemnity clause in your contract has a minor contradiction in Section 4.2, she said, shifting the food bag from one hand to the other. It might seem harmless, but if their lawyers are smart, they can argue that the shareholders weren't fully protected in the event of liquidation. Alexander stared at her. The man had seen ruthless prosecutors, high-profile attorneys, and corporate sharks, but never had he been challenged by a girl in a hoodie carrying takeout. "You're mistaken," he said coolly. Lena crossed her arms. "Then read it again." Something flickered in his gaze. Annoyance, intrigue, maybe both. He picked up the contract, flipping through the pages with expert precision. The room was silent, except for the sound of paper rustling. Seconds stretched into eternity before he suddenly stilled. She was right. A slow exhale escaped his lips, And, for the first time, his expression changed from indifference to something else. Something resembling respect. How did you know that? His voice was lower now, more curious than dismissive. Lena hesitated, suddenly self-conscious. I studied law. His eyes narrowed. You studied law? She lifted her chin. Graduated top of my class. Full scholarship. Alexander's gaze flicked over her delivery uniform, the tired shadows under her eyes, the soaked hoodie. Something about her didn't add up. A legal prodigy, delivering takeout. And yet, you're delivering food at midnight. Lena's stomach clenched. She didn't owe him an explanation, but before she could shut down the conversation, he leaned forward, eyes locked onto hers. Who are you? He asked, and for the first time that night, he really looked at her. A slow, dangerous warmth spread through Lena's chest. Just a girl who needs to get paid, Mr. Reid, she said with a smirk, throwing his own arrogance back at him. She grabbed the tip from the table, turned on her heel, and walked out without a second glance. But Alexander didn't look away. His eyes stayed on her retreating figure, his mind replaying the moment, the sharp wit, the challenge in her gaze, the way she didn't back down. For the first time in years, Alexander Reid was intrigued, and he hated it. Alexander Reid had always prided himself on his ability to forget people who didn't matter. Yet for some reason, he couldn't forget her. He sat at his desk, fingers pressed against his temple, eyes scanning the contract she had so easily dismantled. The sharp, confident way she had pointed out his mistake replayed in his mind, along with the challenge in her honey-brown eyes. Just a girl who needs to get paid, Mr. Reid. That smirk, that defiance. Why the hell was she delivering food when she clearly had the mind of a top-tier lawyer? Annoyed with himself, he shook off the thought. She didn't matter. He had a case to win. But the next morning, as he walked into the office, his assistant, Claire, rushed toward him. Sir, we have a problem. Alexander arched an eyebrow. What kind of problem? Claire hesitated before handing him a folder. The legal challenge from the shareholders. Their lawyers just found a loophole in our indemnity clause. Alexander snatched the file, his stomach tightening as he skimmed the complaint. There it was, the exact flaw that Lena had warned him about. He set the folder down slowly, exhaling through his nose. His entire legal team had missed this, but she didn't. And for the first time in years, he had underestimated someone. The search for Lena Carter. Alexander wasn't the type of man to ignore an asset, and Lena Carter, whether she knew it or not, was an asset. Finding her, however, wasn't as easy as he expected. No employment history in any law firm, no LinkedIn profile, no corporate affiliations, just a brilliant mind wasting away delivering food. It wasn't until 3 days later that he found her again, in the last place he expected. A small coffee shop near the hospital. She sat by the window, her sleeves rolled up, flipping through an old legal textbook while sipping a cup of cheap black coffee. Her hair was loosely tied up, a few curls falling around her face, her fingers tapping absent-mindedly against the paper. For a brief moment, Alexander just watched. She looked different outside the confines of his office, softer yet just as sharp. The kind of woman who had the potential to set fire to the world if only someone gave her the match. He stepped inside, the scent of roasted coffee beans filling the air. Lena didn't look up until he pulled out the chair across from her, his presence impossible to ignore. She blinked. Oh, it's you. Alexander smirked. I'll take that as a warm welcome. She raised an eyebrow. Did you get lost on your way to your penthouse? This coffee shop doesn't exactly scream millionaire CEO. He chuckled. And you don't exactly scream delivery girl. Yet, here we are. Lena pursed her lips, eyeing him suspiciously. Why are you here? Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her. I did some digging. Top of your class. Full scholarship. Impeccable legal mind. He paused. So tell me, Miss Carter. Why the hell aren't you working in a law firm? Lena's fingers curled slightly around her coffee cup. Life happens, Mr. Reid. There was something in her voice, a flicker of something deeper, something personal, a wound she wasn't willing to share. Alexander's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people dodging his questions, but instead of pushing, he changed tactics. You were right, Lena frowned. About what? The loophole in the indemnity clause. Our opponents found it. For a split second, surprise flashed in her eyes before she leaned back, her lips curving into a slow, knowing smile. Well, well. She rested her chin on her hand. Guess you owe me an apology. Alexander smirked. She was enjoying this. How about a job offer instead? Lena blinked. Excuse me? You clearly have the kind of mind I need in my firm. I'm offering you a position. Lena let out a short laugh. Just like that. You insult me, underestimate me, and now suddenly I'm worthy of your firm? Alexander's expression remained unreadable. I don't let talent go to waste. Or is it that you don't like being wrong? He held her gaze, something dark and unreadable swirling in his stormy grey eyes. I don't like losing. Lena exhaled, tapping her fingers on the table. I don't need your charity, Mr. Reid. His lips twitched. I don't offer charity. I offer opportunities. The question is, are you smart enough to take it? Something in her flickered, the part of her that had always dreamed of standing in a courtroom, proving her worth, making a name for herself. For a brief moment she imagined what it would be like, to work for a man like him, to challenge him, to learn from him, to stand beside him. And for the first time in a long time, her heart pounded not from fear, but excitement. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes locking onto his. Fine, I'll take the job. Alexander's smirk deepened, something dangerous and victorious flickering in his gaze. Good choice. But as Lena sat there, feeling the weight of the decision settle in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a job offer. It was the beginning of something more, something undeniable, something that could change both of their lives forever. Lena Carter had faced many challenges in her life, growing up with an absent father taking care of her sick mother, fighting tooth and nail for her law degree, but nothing prepared her for working under Alexander Reid. The moment she stepped into Reid and Associates, she felt the stares, the sharp, judgmental glances of high-powered attorneys who had spent years clawing their way up the corporate ladder. To them, she was a nobody, a delivery girl who had no place among them. And she felt it. But Lena wasn't the kind of woman who backed down. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked through the corridors like she belonged there. She wasn't going to let anyone, including Alexander, make her feel small. The test Alexander was waiting for her in his glass-walled office, his gaze unreadable as she stepped inside. You're late, Lena raised an eyebrow. It's 8:59. His lips twitched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he slid a thick legal file across the table. Your first test. Lena's eyes flicked down to the paperwork, scanning the front page. A high-stakes corporate merger worth billions. Tell me what you see, Alexander said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. Lena hesitated for only a second before picking up the file, her sharp mind kicking into overdrive. The silence in the room was thick, charged. Alexander watched her with intensity, his gaze never leaving her face. She could feel it, the weight of his attention, the way his eyes traced her expressions, as if trying to decipher every thought running through her head. She ignored the way her pulse quickened. She had work to do. Her eyes skimmed the clauses, dissecting the legal jargon, peeling back the layers of deception hidden in the fine print. Then, she saw it. A strategic loophole buried deep within the contract. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was there. Lena exhaled, setting the file down. The other party is planning to back out of the deal at the last minute, aren't they? She said, her voice steady. Alexander's sharp eyes darkened, with intrigue. What makes you think that? Lena tapped the contract. Clause 7.4. It's structured in a way that gives them an escape route if the deal isn't finalised by a specific date. But the wording is deceptive. It makes it look like a technicality rather than an intentional loophole. If I were them, I'd be using this as leverage to negotiate a better deal or walk away entirely. Silence. Then, a slow, satisfied smirk tugged at Alexander's lips. Interesting, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Lena's heart thudded against her ribs, because for the first time she had impressed him. And she knew it. The slow shift. Lena wasn't expecting warmth from Alexander, and she certainly didn't get it. Instead, she got something far more dangerous. Attention. The kind that made her stomach tighten. The kind that made her skin prickle. The kind that made it impossible to ignore him. He started watching her differently, not with skepticism, but with something far more intense. And the more they worked together, the more their verbal sparring turned into something else. Something charged. Your logic is flawed, Carter. No, it's not. You just don't like admitting when I'm right. His eyes would darken, that slow smirk playing at the corner of his lips. And God help her, she liked it. The late nights. The first time Lena stayed past midnight at the firm, she didn't expect anyone else to be there. But as she flipped through legal documents, stretching out her sore muscles, she heard the deep timbre of his voice behind her. Still here? She turned. Alexander stood in the doorway, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, exposing the strong lines of his forearms. His tie was loose, the top button of his shirt undone. Lena swallowed. Damn him for looking so good. She cleared her throat. Could say the same about you. He walked toward her, his presence too big, too overwhelming in the quiet space. I don't sleep much, he admitted. Lena raised an eyebrow. Because you love your work, or because you're avoiding something? His eyes flickered, just for a second. Then, he smirked. Are you psychoanalyzing me, Carter? She shrugged, tilting her head. Maybe. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips. A flicker of something raw, something unspoken. Her breath caught. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like the air between them had changed, like something dangerous was about to happen. Then, just as quickly as it came, he stepped back. Lena let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Alexander picked up a file, his voice back to its usual controlled, unreadable tone. Get some sleep, Carter. We have a long day tomorrow. And with that, he walked away. Lena stared after him, her heart pounding, because for the first time since she met him, she realized she wasn't just drawn to his mind, she was drawn to him. And that was dangerous. Lena had been working at Reid and Associates for just over a month, and already the landscape of her life had shifted. The challenge of proving herself in an elite, cutthroat environment was nothing compared to the silent battle she fought every day, a battle against her own heart, because every day she spent hours locked in an office with Alexander Reid. Every day she was subjected to his sharp mind, his infuriating smirks, the way his sleeves rolled up as he leaned over files, completely engrossed in his work. And every damn day she found herself staring too long, breathing too fast, feeling too much. She told herself it was just admiration, just respect. But deep down she knew it was more than that. Much more. A night that changed everything. The city glittered beneath them as another late night stretched on in the firm. The rest of the office had long emptied, leaving only the two of them, working side by side. Alexander sat across from her, his tie loosened, the top buttons of his crisp white shirt undone. He had been like this all night, focused, intense, oblivious to the fact that every small move he made was slowly driving her insane. Lena let out a tired sigh, rubbing her temples. Alexander glanced up. Tired already? She rolled her eyes. Some of us are human, Reid. We require food and sleep. A rare chuckle escaped him. Sleep is overrated. Lena narrowed her eyes, watching the way his fingers traced the rim of his whiskey glass. There was something off about him tonight. He was tense, his usual control barely intact. She hesitated before asking, "What's on your mind?" Alexander looked at her, his gaze flickering with something unreadable. "I lost my first case once." Lena blinked. Alexander Reid, the undefeated corporate king, had lost. "What happened?" she asked, curiosity piqued. He exhaled slowly, rolling the whiskey in his glass. "I was too arrogant, thought I had everything under control. Then, in the courtroom, I realized I had missed something crucial. One small detail. It cost my client millions." Lena studied him. His face was neutral, but his eyes burned with old wounds. "And you never let yourself make a mistake again," she guessed. His gaze met hers, something dark flashing beneath the surface. "I never lose. Not anymore." A shiver ran through her, because she knew this man carried the weight of his victories like armor, but he carried his failures like chains. Something about that made her chest ache. Before she could stop herself, she reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Alexander's entire body tensed. The room seemed to still, the air between them crackling like a live wire. His hand was warm beneath hers, strong, steady. But there was something vulnerable in the way his fingers twitched slightly, like he wasn't used to being touched. Lena swallowed, suddenly feeling like she had crossed a line she wasn't ready for. She moved to pull away, but before she could, his fingers curled around hers. Her breath hitched. Alexander didn't speak, didn't move. He just held her hand, his thumb grazing lightly over her skin. It was the smallest of touches, but it sent a wildfire of emotions racing through her. Attraction, need, something deeper. Slowly he looked up, his gaze locking onto hers, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw him drop his guard, completely. His voice was low, rough when he finally spoke. "You make me forget myself, Carter." Lena's heart pounded, because for the first time, she wanted him to. The almost kiss. The space between them had disappeared. She wasn't sure when it had happened, but now he was close. So close that she could see the specks of silver in his grey eyes. His gaze dropped to her lips and she felt it. The undeniable pull between them, the slow-burning fire they had been fighting since the moment they met. Lena's breathing grew unsteady as Alexander lifted a hand, his fingers grazing the side of her face, trailing down to the curve of her jaw. Her skin burned beneath his touch. And then, he leaned in. Her pulse skyrocketed. For a brief fleeting second, she swore he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to. God, she wanted him to. But just before their lips could meet, his phone rang. The sharp sound shattered the moment like glass. Alexander pulled back instantly, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists as if he was physically restraining himself. Lena exhaled, pressing a hand to her racing heart, trying to catch her breath. She felt unsteady, shaken, completely undone. Alexander grabbed his phone, answering in his usual controlled tone, but his eyes were still on her, filled with an intensity that made her shiver. After a few moments, he hung up and exhaled deeply, running a hand through his dark hair. Then, without another word, he grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door. But just as he reached the threshold, he hesitated. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "Go home, Carter." Lena watched him go, her heart still hammering, because she knew that wasn't just a goodbye. That was a warning that whatever was happening between them, it was dangerous. And if they weren't careful, they were both going to fall. A distance she couldn't ignore. After that almost kiss, everything changed. Or rather, everything stayed the same, and that was the problem. Alexander acted as if that night had never happened. He was as cold, calculated, and unreadable as ever. Their routine remained the same: long hours, late nights, sharp debates over legal strategy. But now the air between them felt suffocating. Every time he walked past her, her skin prickled with awareness. Every time his hand brushed against hers while exchanging documents, electricity shot through her veins. Every time their gazes locked in a silent war of tension and something unspoken, Lena wondered if she was imagining it all. Because if Alexander felt what she felt, why was he keeping his distance? The warning one evening, as she was reviewing a case file, Claire, the firm's senior legal associate, stopped by her desk. "Word of advice, Carter," Claire said, her tone casual but her gaze sharp. Lena raised an eyebrow. "I didn't ask for one." Claire smirked. "Then consider it free legal counsel. Don't get too comfortable with Mr. Reid. He doesn't mix business with distractions." Lena felt her chest tighten, but she masked it with a cool stare. "Distractions?" she echoed. Claire shrugged. "You're new, so maybe you don't know. But women who get too close to Alexander Reid, they don't last long here." Lena clenched her jaw. She wanted to laugh it off, pretend Claire's words meant nothing. But deep down, they hit too close to home. Because wasn't that what Alexander was doing? Pushing her away before she could become a distraction? The thought made something ache deep inside her. The betrayal. A week later, everything fell apart. Lena was in the break room sipping coffee when she overheard two attorneys whispering nearby. "Did you hear? Someone leaked confidential case details to the opposition." "Yeah, and word is, it came from inside the firm." Lena frowned, a bad feeling creeping up her spine. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. She had barely stepped back into her office when security arrived. "Miss Carter, you need to come with us." Her heart dropped. Before she could process what was happening, they escorted her straight to Alexander's office. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. Alexander sat behind his desk, his expression stone cold. The air was heavy, dangerous. "Sit down, Carter." Lena sat, her pulse hammering. He slid a file across the desk. "Do you recognize this?" She picked it up, her stomach twisting as she read the contents. It was an internal report on a high-profile client's legal strategy. Her name was attached to it. Her breath caught. "What the hell is this?" Alexander's voice was like ice. "That document was leaked to opposing counsel, and the firm traced the breach back to your credentials." Lena's blood turned cold. "You think I did this?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. "Your login was used to access the files at an unusual hour." She shook her head, anger and hurt colliding inside her. "I would never betray this firm. Or you." Alexander's eyes flickered, but only for a second. Then his walls slammed back up. "Then explain how your name ended up on this." Lena stood, her hands clenched into fists. "You know me better than this, Alexander. If you really believe I would do something like this, then maybe I never belonged here in the first place." The words hung between them, sharp as a blade. For a brief moment she thought, hoped, he would stop her. That he would tell her he trusted her, that he would fight for her the way she had fought for herself her whole life, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring at her, letting her walk away. And with that, her heart shattered. The aftermath. Lena stormed out of the office, ignoring the stares, ignoring the way her hands trembled. The betrayal cut deeper than she expected. Not because she lost the job, but because she lost him. She had let herself believe, even for a moment, that she was more than just an employee to him, that she was something real, but clearly she was nothing, because when it really mattered, he hadn't fought for her. The truth comes out. 2 days later, Alexander found out the truth. The real culprit was a senior associate, one who had framed Lena to cover their own tracks. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been wrong, horribly, unforgivably wrong. Lena had been innocent, and he had let her go. For the first time in years, Alexander Reid felt something he couldn't control. Guilt. And beneath that, something worse, a hollow, aching emptiness. Because losing Lena wasn't just a mistake, it was the biggest mistake of his life. The weight of regret. Alexander Reid had made many mistakes in his life, but none haunted him like losing Lena. His office, once his sanctuary, felt empty. cold, suffocating. Every time he glanced at her old desk, something twisted deep inside his chest. For days he had buried himself in work, hoping logic and deadlines would erase the suffocating guilt, but nothing worked. Because every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was the look on her face when he let her walk away. And for the first time in years, he realized he had been terrified, not of losing a case, not of making a legal misstep, but of how much she meant to him. And now it was too late. Or was it? The search for Lena Alexander was a man who never lost, and he wasn't about to start now. Tracking Lena down, however, was harder than expected. She had cut ties with the firm completely. No messages, no explanations, no trace of her anywhere. Until one night, as he sat in his penthouse, drowning in whiskey and frustration, his phone buzzed. A news alert. His breath caught. Lena Carter was in court, and she was winning. The courtroom showdown. The next morning, Alexander stepped into the courthouse, his presence commanding and undeniable. Every lawyer in the room turned as he entered, but he only had eyes for her. Lena stood at the front, fierce and radiant, her brown curls framing her face as she argued passionately for her pro bono client. She wasn't just good, she was brilliant. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest as he watched her, the fire in her eyes, the way she didn't just fight the case but owned the courtroom. She had always been meant for this, and he had nearly destroyed her chance. The judge banged his gavel. "Miss Carter, your argument is compelling. The court rules in favor of your client." The moment the verdict was announced, a wave of emotion washed over Lena. She had done it. She had proved herself. And yet, as she turned to leave, she froze. Because standing at the back of the courtroom, watching her like she was the only thing in the world, was Alexander Reid. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The confrontation. She found him waiting outside the courthouse, leaning against his sleek black car, hands in his pockets. Lena should have ignored him. But she couldn't, because even after everything, he still had a hold on her heart. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here, Reid." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Alexander pushed off the car, stepping closer, too close. His grey eyes burned into hers. "I was wrong," Lena scoffed, crossing her arms. "Which part? Accusing me? Not trusting me? Watching me walk away without a second thought?" His jaw tightened. "Every part." The sincerity in his voice nearly broke her. "I should have believed in you, Lena. I should have fought for you. And I didn't." Her breath hitched. She wanted to hate him. But the way he looked at her, like she was the only thing that mattered, made it impossible. "I don't need your apology, Alexander," she whispered. "I made it on my own." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I know, and I'm so damn proud of you." Lena swallowed hard. Why did he have to say things like that? Why did he have to make this so damn difficult? "Then why are you here?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Alexander took another step, his fingers grazing the side of her face, tucking a curl behind her ear. "Because letting you go was the biggest mistake of my life." Her heart stopped. "And I don't want to make another one." The grand gesture. Alexander wasn't a man who begged, but for her, he would do anything. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a contract. Lena frowned. "What is this?" He smirked, that familiar fire back in his eyes. "A partnership agreement. For your own law firm. With me." She stared at him, completely speechless. "You don't belong under anyone, Lena, not even me." His voice softened. "You deserve to be the best, to run your own firm. I just want to stand beside you when you do it." Lena felt tears burn in her eyes. She had spent her whole life fighting to prove her worth. And now the most powerful man she had ever met wasn't asking her to work for him. He was asking to build something with her. "This is crazy," she whispered. Alexander smiled. "That's what they said about us from the start." Lena exhaled, her heart warring with her mind, but deep down she knew. She had already forgiven him, because she had fallen for him long before she ever realized it. She shook her head, laughing softly. "I swear you are impossible." Alexander grinned. "You wouldn't want me any other way." And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed his tie, pulled him down, and kissed him. The moment their lips met, everything else disappeared. It was fierce, desperate, weeks of tension, of longing, of things left unsaid finally breaking free. Alexander groaned against her mouth, his hands sliding around her waist, pulling her closer, deeper, as if letting her go was no longer an option. Because it wasn't. Not anymore. They were past the point of no return, and neither of them would have it any other way. The morning after the kiss, Lena woke up to the golden sunlight streaming through her apartment window, her heart still pounding from the night before. Her lips still tingled, her skin still burned where Alexander had touched her. And yet, doubt crept in. What did this mean for them? Was it just passion, just attraction, just the heat of the moment? Or was it something more? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She knew before opening it. It was him. And when she did, there he was, standing in her doorway in a crisp suit, looking as devastatingly handsome as ever, holding 2 coffee cups in his hands. "You left before I could buy you breakfast, Carter," he said, smirking. Lena folded her arms. "I don't need breakfast from you, Reid." His gaze darkened, sweeping over her like he was remembering exactly what happened last night. "No, but you need coffee," he countered smoothly, handing her the cup. Lena sighed, shaking her head. "You're impossible. And yet, here you are, letting me in." She hated that he was right. She stepped aside, letting him in, but her heart hammered in her chest. Because the real question was, where did they go from here? The unspoken words. They sat across from each other, drinking coffee in a comfortable but charged silence. Finally, Lena spoke. "This, whatever this is, it's not just a game to you, is it?" Alexander set his cup down, leaning forward, his gaze unwavering. "Does it feel like a game to you?" Lena's breath hitched. Number it didn't. Because if it were, it wouldn't scare her so damn much. "I don't know how to do this, Alexander," she admitted, her voice softer now. For once, she let herself be vulnerable. Alexander reached across the table, taking her hand in his thumb grazing her skin in slow, soothing circles. "Then we figure it out. Together." Her heart clenched at his words. Because this wasn't the cold, ruthless CEO speaking. This was the man underneath, the man who saw her, who wanted her, not just for a fleeting moment, but for something real. And it terrified her, because what if she let herself fall, completely fall, and he changed his mind? Fear and love. Later that night, Lena found herself in Alexander's penthouse, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows as the city lights flickered beneath them. Alexander stood behind her, his presence warm, strong, consuming. She felt his breath at her ear before he spoke. "What's holding you back, Carter?" She exhaled slowly. "I don't want to be just another woman who gets lost in your world, Alexander." He turned her around gently, his hands sliding to her waist. "You're not, and you never will be." Lena searched his eyes, looking for any sign of hesitation. There was none. There was only undeniable truth. "This isn't just about attraction, Lena. It never was." Her heart stopped, because neither of them had said it, neither of them had dared, but now the words hung between them, so real, so terrifying, so utterly inescapable. "Say it, Alexander," she whispered. His hand came up, his fingers tilting her chin so she couldn't look away. "I love you, Lena." Her breath caught, her entire world shifting with those 4 words. "I should have told you sooner. I should have fought harder. But I won't make that mistake again." Lena felt her walls crumble, because this wasn't just a confession. It was a promise that he wasn't letting go. and neither was she. Tears burned in her eyes, but she smiled. "You really are impossible, you know that," Alexander chuckled, brushing a thumb across her cheek. "But you love me anyway." She let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, I do." And this time, when he kissed her, it wasn't desperate or urgent or filled with doubt. It was slow, deep, unbreakable, because this time there were no more walls, no more fears, no more pretending. They were finally home. The morning after, everything changed. For the first time in a long time, Lena Carter woke up feeling at peace. The sun peeked through the curtains of Alexander's penthouse, casting golden light across the room. She turned onto her side, and there he was, Alexander Reid, asleep beside her. It was a rare sight. He looked different like this, softer, his usual tension gone. His hair was slightly messy, his breathing slow, his bare chest rising and falling rhythmically. Lena smiled, reaching out to trace the outline of his jaw, unable to resist. The moment her fingers brushed his skin, his eyes fluttered open, stormy grey, filled with something deeper than just sleep. "You're staring, Carter," he murmured, voice thick with sleep. Lena smirked. "And you're drooling, Reid." He let out a soft chuckle, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her closer. "Liar." His voice was low, husky, sending a shiver through her. Lena bit her lip as his fingers trailed up her back, leaving fire in their wake. "You're dangerous, you know that?" she whispered. Alexander's lips ghosted over her temple, his voice warm and rough. "Only for you." Her heart clenched, and in that moment she knew she had never been more in love with anyone in her entire life. Lena's biggest victory. Yet 1 week later, Lena stood in her new office. Her office. She still couldn't believe it. The partnership she had once dreamed of was now real. She and Alexander had launched a new law firm together, an empire built on trust, respect, and an undeniable connection. And today was the day she proved, once and for all, that she belonged here. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters and corporate executives. It was her first case as a lead attorney, and the stakes? Massive. It was a high-profile fraud case, and she was representing a single mother who had been wrongfully targeted by a billion-dollar corporation. Her opponent was one of the most ruthless attorneys in the field, a man who had underestimated her from the moment she walked in. Big mistake. Because Lena Carter wasn't just a lawyer, she was a force of nature. She delivered her arguments with precision, confidence, and undeniable brilliance. Every counterpoint, every objection, every perfectly placed fact, it all led to one thing: victory. The judge ruled in favor of her client. And just like that, Lena had won her first major case. As the reporters swarmed outside, flashing cameras and throwing questions, Lena stepped into the hallway, only to find Alexander waiting for her. His expression? Proud. Unbelievably proud. She barely had time to say a word before he pulled her aside, away from the crowd into a quiet corner, and then he kissed her, right there, in the courthouse, in front of everyone. It wasn't just any kiss, it was fierce, breathtaking, filled with everything he had been holding back all day. When he finally pulled away, his forehead resting against hers, he murmured, "I knew you'd win." Lena let out a breathless laugh. "You sound so sure," he smirked, "because I know exactly what you're capable of, Carter." Her heart swelled, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting alone. A love that would last forever. Later that night, they celebrated at his penthouse, alone. The city glittered below them, but Lena only cared about the man standing in front of her. Alexander poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to her. "To your first big win," he said, clinking his glass against hers. Lena smirked. "To our first big win?" They sipped in silence, the energy between them charged with something deeper than words. Then Alexander set his glass down, his eyes darker now, more intense. He stepped toward her, gently taking the glass from her hands and placing it aside. "What?" she asked, breathless. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing her bottom lip. I want to make you a different kind of deal, Carter. Lena raised an eyebrow, trying to keep up with the way her pulse was racing. What kind of deal? Alexander took a slow breath, as if steadying himself. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Lena's heart stopped. The world around them faded, because in the center of that box was a ring. Her throat tightened as tears pricked at her eyes. Alexander. He took her hands in his voice raw, unguarded, completely open. I told you once that I don't like losing, he exhaled. But if losing you is the price, then I never want to win again. A tear slipped down her cheek. You drive me insane, Carter. You challenge me, you infuriate me, and somehow you make me want to be a better man every damn day. Lena let out a shaky breath, her chest aching with love. Alexander dropped to one knee. So, let's make this official. His lips curved into that signature smirk, the one that had driven her crazy from the start. Marry me, Carter. Lena laughed through her tears, shaking her head in disbelief. This man. This impossible, arrogant, beautiful man. She never stood a chance. Yes, Alexander. Her voice trembled. I'll marry you. His jaw tightened, his eyes burning with something fierce and undeniable, and then he kissed her. It was a kiss of forever. A kiss that sealed not just a promise, but a lifetime. Because in the end, he wasn't just the man she worked for. He wasn't just the man who had underestimated her. He was the man who had fallen for her. And she had fallen right back. A wedding to remember. The day Lena Carter had never dared to dream about had finally arrived. She stood in front of a mirror, dressed in the most elegant, breathtaking wedding gown. It was simple yet timeless. Ivory silk hugging her curves, delicate lace caressing her shoulders, the fabric flowing like a dream. Her hair was styled in soft waves, a few loose curls framing her face, and her makeup was natural, radiant, the glow of a woman who had found everything she never knew she needed. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the engagement ring on her finger, the one Alexander had slipped onto her hand with such reverence, such intensity, such love. It was real. She was marrying him today. A soft knock on the door made her turn. Her best friend and maid of honor, Emily, peeked inside. Ready? Lena took a deep breath, her heart pounding with excitement, nerves, and a love so overwhelming it felt impossible to contain. Then, she smiled. More than ever. The moment he saw her. The wedding took place in a grand yet intimate setting. The hall was decorated with soft white roses, golden fairy lights, and flickering candles that cast a warm glow across the space, but none of it mattered to Alexander Reid, because the moment the doors opened and Lena stepped in, his entire world stopped. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse roaring in his ears. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a second it was just them. No crowded room, no expectations, just her and him. The woman who had challenged him, changed him, made him fall in love in ways he never thought possible. She walked toward him, graceful, confident, breathtaking. And when she finally reached him, he couldn't stop himself. He leaned in slightly, whispering, "You're stunning, Carter." Lena smirked, the teasing glint in her eyes making his chest tighten. "You're not so bad yourself, Reid." His lips twitched, but beneath his amusement, there was something deeper, something that spoke of forever. The vows that changed everything. When it was time to exchange vows, Lena took a steady breath, holding on to Alexander's hands. Her voice was strong, but her heart was bare. "I never believed in fairy tales, Alexander. I never thought love was something I would find. Not real love, not the kind that makes you want to be better, to fight, to stay." She exhaled, her fingers tightening around his. "And then you came along, arrogant, impossible, completely infuriating." Laughter echoed softly through the room. Alexander smirked, shaking his head. Accurate, Lena smiled, her voice turning softer. But you also showed me that love isn't about perfection. It's about standing beside someone even when it's hard, even when it's messy. You taught me that real love doesn't ask you to shrink, it asks you to rise. A lump formed in Alexander's throat, because this woman, this incredible, fierce, brilliant woman, was his. Forever. His voice was deep, steady when he spoke. Lena Carter, you turned my world upside down the moment you walked into my office. I thought I knew everything. I thought I had life figured out. His lips curled slightly. And then you proved me wrong, over and over again. Lena laughed softly, but her eyes shimmered with emotion. You are the most extraordinary person I've ever met. And loving you, it's the easiest, most inevitable thing I've ever done. He cupped her cheek, brushing away the tear that slipped down her face. So I promise you this, I will fight for us. I will stand beside you, support you, love you every single day. Lena let out a shaky breath, and then he slid the ring onto her finger. For better or worse, Carter, I'm yours. Always. A tear slipped down her cheek, but her smile was radiant. Always, Reid. The officiant grinned. You may now kiss the bride. And Alexander didn't hesitate. He captured her lips in a deep, breathtaking kiss, one filled with love, passion, and an unbreakable promise. The room erupted in cheers. But for them, there was only each other. Happily ever after. The reception was a blur of laughter, stolen kisses, and whispered, I love yous. Lena danced in Alexander's arms, the warmth of his body pressed against hers, their foreheads touching as they swayed to the music. So, Mrs. Reid, how does it feel? He murmured against her ear. A soft laugh escaped her. Strange, unreal. Perfect. His arms tightened around her. Good, because I plan on spending the rest of my life making sure you feel that way. Lena's heart swelled, because she believed him. They had been through hell together. They had fought, challenged, and nearly lost each other. But in the end, they had chosen love. And now? Now they had forever. As she leaned up to kiss him again, she whispered, You were right about one thing, Reid. He raised an eyebrow, smirking. Only one? Lena grinned. Some things really are inevitable. And then she kissed her husband, sealing their forever.